As we go to the end here of Matthew, we're into the nitty-gritty of things, and in these last few chapters, it's really one story, if you will. And it feels like we should, have a fireplace and a comfy chair or two, and kind of gather around and just sort of listen to the whole story. Because here's the thing, we could go through chapter 26 and chop it into pieces. We could go through in this first section that we're going to look at today, we could talk about prayer. And, we'd all leave like, yes, I need to pray more. Okay. And then the next week we could talk about, Jesus being arrested and the betrayal by Judas and looking at that. Was Judas really a saved person or was he not? And all of those things. Or we could go through it like that, but we're going to go through it a little, bigger chunk just for this sake. It's one story. And if we dive in real close, we might miss the bigger picture of what's really going on. Ultimately, as we saw last week, Jesus is in control. And so all these things that happen around him and to him, he's not surprised by, he's not shocked by it, he's intimately involved in all the details. And it gives us then that feeling of like, imagine what it would have been like. Put yourself in the shoes or the sandals, if you will, of the disciples of that day, as they're with Jesus. And then maybe you switch to, maybe you are thinking, I'm a Roman soldier, or, think about it that way. Because we've got this far off view. We know how it ends, and it is glorious. That's why we sing about the cross, because we know what the cross has done and what the end result was through the resurrection. It's all good. But if you're there at this moment, it's not good. You're thinking one thing is about to happen and the very opposite is going to happen. You're still thinking, even though Jesus keeps telling them, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again and come back. They're like, yeah, someday he's going to die. But before that, he's going to set the kingdom, and here we go. And so keep all those things in mind as we go through, starting in Matthew 26, verse 36. It says, Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. He's going to pray because strength is needed. It's a good time to pray. Whenever you need strength, go to prayer. And where is he going to go? Well, he's going to go to a place where he's gone many times before. He's going to go to Gethsemane, this area on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, surrounded by ancient olive trees. Gethsemane means olive press. There the olives from the neighborhood were brought and they were crushed for their oil. So too the Son of Man would be crushed in an appropriate place. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. He came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. And he came to the disciples and said to them, Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. They're on their way to Gethsemane. They've just left the upper room where they've experienced this wonderful time with the Lord, mixed with, there's a betrayer amongst us. And then they have communion, and he details how this is all new. It's going to be this new covenant. And then they sing, and they're walking as they're singing this hymn, and being encouraged by the words of the Psalms. And they get to Gethsemane. You guys stay here, Peter, James, and John. Let's go a little further. You're going to be closer. You're going to be nearer. I need you guys to be praying, to be encouraging, and standing with me. That didn't go so well. They are the guys that got to be there for the Mount of Transfiguration. They were there in the home of Jairus when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. Not all of the disciples were in the room. Not all of the disciples were on the mountain, but James, John, and Peter. They were there to be close. They were there to pray alongside Jesus. Jesus went there, Luke tells us, as was his custom. His habit. What he regularly did when they're in Jerusalem. And in general, as you see through the Gospels, he went away to pray. He had times of prayer. He got away from the crowd to pray. He prayed until he was filled, until he was strengthened, until there was an answer, until he understood the mind and the heart of the Father. What was to come was the wrath of God. This cup that it speaks of. And what he's going to ultimately pray is not what I will, but what you will be done. See, the cup is why he's there. Jesus said in John 18 to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Keep that in mind when we get to that part. The cup, it's the wrath of God being poured out upon sinful man. He himself, 1 Peter 2, bore our sins in his body on the tree that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. He's there praying about what's to come. What's to come is the wrath, the suffering, the shame. And 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "For our sake he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." No one else could say that. No one else could die in our place, but the one who sinned less. And sin was put upon him. Our sin, my sin, your sin, all sin upon the one who was perfect. So he's not praying in the garden asking for forgiveness for sin. He's not praying like, I hope it goes well. He's praying for strength. He's praying for, if there's another way, Father, if there's a plan B, let's do plan B. He says, but no, not what I will, but what you will. He understood the mission. That's why he was there. That's why he came for this very moment, this very time, was to go to the cross. And so prayer, this time in the garden, 3 hours of prayer. In the other Gospels it tells us not just, he's not just praying, God, give me a good day, thanks for today. He's praying in agony and sorrow, drops of blood. That's intense. That's a kind of prayer that none of us have experienced. But you probably and possibly have experienced something similar. Maybe not to that extent. Not the weight of all what's to come that Jesus knew about, but there's things going on and you're sorrowful. There's circumstances you can't figure out and you're praying and it feels like there's just the weight of the world. That's the kind of prayer Jesus was engaged in. It wasn't light, it wasn't trivial, it was intense. And he's asking the disciples to pray with him. And every time he goes back to them, they're sleeping. Why? Because the flesh is weak. The spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. Right? So if you try to sleep or go to bed and I'm going to pray before I sleep while I'm in bed, how does that go? Lord, I think. That's how it goes if I try. Because why? I'm going to sleep when I go to bed. Right? It's like. Now maybe you take a little longer to go to sleep and that works for you and it becomes like counting sheep, your prayer. And that's okay. Maybe you have a better time, right? You have a different custom. Your custom is, and you have that place, that time where you're regularly praying. Jesus had this custom. He had this place. See, he knew that's where Judas would go looking for him. He could have chosen somewhere else. I'm not going to go where he knows I'm going to be. Right in the movies, when the good guy becomes the bad guy, so they have to change their plans because the bad guy knows what the good guys are going to do. It's like, we're not going to do what we normally do because he knows what we normally do. So we got to do something different. Jesus knew Judas is coming to the garden. And so he just kept with it. He said, no, this is what has to happen to be fulfilled. Prophecy has to be fulfilled. In all of this, there's a humbleness about Jesus. This self-sacrifice, this Not what I will, but what you will be done. It is born out of Philippians 2. We've read it in the last little while. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, think about that. We can have the same mind. It's ours in Christ Jesus. We can have his mindset, who though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming, and you underline it, obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. The battle wasn't won at the cross. It was already won here in the garden, where he's kneeling down so he can rise with power and with strength. Because he knelt down, he could walk to the cross. He could go to the cross because the battle he'd been obedient. Sometimes in our prayers, that's not how it goes for us, right? Because we're thinking of ourselves. We're thinking of what we've got our list of, God, here's what I like, here's what I, if it's according to your will. It's like a little PS. Maybe a PPS, because the PS is like, oh, I forgot this. And then, oh yeah, by the way, oh, according to your will. It's like, I want you to do all this. I need this and this and this, if that's your will. And we don't really want his will because we want what we want. How do we get from there to Jesus, not what I will, but what you will? I think it's continual work, a continual thing that we surrender, a continual humility that has to happen in our lives, that we learn to pray that way and live that way, where we are acknowledging, God, really, I don't see the way through this, I don't see how it's going to turn out, but I want what you want for it. Even if I don't like how it's going to turn out. That's how you know you're praying rightly. Why? Because you're submitting yourself to his will, no matter what. Jesus knows how this is going to go by saying, not what I will, but what you will be done. He understands the implications. He knows. We don't have that ability to see what's coming. But if we have that mindset, which Paul says that in Philippians, we can have, like Christ, of humility, we can enter into whatever comes in the same manner, in the same way. I don't know what's coming, God, but I want it because it's what you want for me. And so help me to embrace and to go through, to survive, however you want to phrase it, but according to your will. And then it doesn't become a PS. It doesn't become an afterthought, a blessing that you hope God does for us. It's really genuinely how you pray and then live out life. But notice that didn't happen right away. That was 3 hours of prayer. That was sweat, drops of blood. That was intense. It's okay to keep coming back. Are you sure this is the right thing, God? Are you sure this is the answer for me, for this situation, for that? It's okay to press in and to grab hold. God's not going to turn you away. Well, you've already prayed about this a lot. Like, are you a little dull? I've already shown you. I've given you the answer. No, keep pressing in. Contrast to Jesus, the disciples are sleeping. We see in all of this, prayer is important, obviously. Humility is important. And then what we'll see is because they're sleeping, they're not prepared for what's to come. Because they were supposed to be watching and praying that you would not fall into temptation, verse 41. And Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He's letting them know, hey, this is serious stuff. You need to be ready. And that's true for our lives in general. Is that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We're just one step away from disaster. Why? Because our flesh wants what the flesh wants. And so we have to be in the spirit. How do you get there? Prayer. Chuck Smith said, prayer is the most important activity a born-again Christian can perform. It should head your list of priorities, for certainly the world around us desperately needs prayer. Prayer will open the door for God to do a glorious work in these last days. Prayer will stem the tide of evil. Ultimately, what you'll come to is what Jesus says there at the end. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. He's in control. He's not surprised that Judas is showing up. He's not surprised at what's coming. And if we get to that place in prayer, man, hey, you're in control. I'm going to walk it out however you seem and deem it to be fit. Verse 47, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. And with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. The betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, seize him." He came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." And then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. Judas came with a crowd, up to maybe some say 600 or more. Why? He's expecting a fight. Why? Because his mindset was the same as the other 11. Jesus is going to be king. So the way you become king in that day was you defeat the present king. So he's expecting a fight. And so he brings a crowd. And it's dark. It's in the forest, in the slopes there, the Mount of Olives area. And they've got torches and swords and clubs and all kinds of people. And he's going to come up and say, "The one I kissed, that's the guy." Like, what? Yeah, Jesus was just indistinguishable. You couldn't tell. You didn't have a glow. Oh, there's Jesus. He's glowing. You didn't know, right? And so he had to give this special sign. And what does Jesus do? "Hey, Judas, the betrayer." No, he says, "Friend." Friend? He's anything but a... I mean, if you have friends like this, you don't need enemies. This is not a friend. But that's the love of Jesus. Even then, he calls him friend. Do what you came to do. I think it just shows the long suffering of the Lord. Why? Because as they're gathered around the table for Passover, and Jesus says, "One of you will betray," and they're all like, "Who, me? Who, me?" And Judas is like, "Is it I, Lord?" "Yeah, of course it's you." And then here, what's Jesus doing? He's long suffering. Even then, there's opportunities for escape from temptation. At the table, "Is it I, Lord?" "Yeah, it's you." Judas could have said, "Yeah, it is me, and I don't want to do this." It would have been over. Here, friend. We would be like, "Weasel, snitch, get away from me." Friend, do what you came to do. Jesus is peaceful about it all. Others, not so much. It says, one of those who were with Jesus, verse 51, stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. I'll give you one guess who that was. Survey says, Peter. John chapter 18. Remember, he's a fisherman. So we're not sure if he's really, really good with the sword or really, really bad. Why? He pulls out the sword and was he going for the head kill shot and just got the ear? Oops. Was he really skilled and going for the ear? We don't know. I'm thinking, if you're a fisherman, you're not necessarily so handy with the sword. Jesus is not worried about the crowd. He's not worried about all the torches and the spears and the swords and all those. He says, "Hey, we don't need to go that route." In fact, in Luke 22, he takes the ear and he touches Malchus. That's his name. John tells us. He says, "Peter, Peter." Now imagine you're part of the group. You're in the high priest's courtyard. You're one of those who know, you're up close, so you can see what's happening. I mean, it's 600 people, you're not getting too close, but you're one of the ones that are in the inner circle there. You see this guy wield a sword. You're like, ready. And then Jesus is like, hey, it's okay. Did he just do what I think he just did? No, I think like, what happened here? I mean, that would have been something. Right? Blood spurting out. I mean, like, I need a plastic surgeon like that. That's amazing. But what would you, I mean, imagine you were part of that crowd. You're coming to arrest some guy who takes an ear off the ground and puts it back in place. That's time to step away. Let's just leave that dude alone. This is a little scary. Imagine if you're the disciples. And Jesus says, hey, put your sword away. All who take the sword will perish by the sword. This is not the plan here. This is not what we need. This is not the Knights of the Round Table. You guys don't have Excalibur here. This is not what God has ordained for this moment. He says, don't you think I can appeal to my Father and he'll send 12 legions of angels? A legion had 6,000. 12 times 6. You can do the math. It's a lot of angels. Consider this. In the Old Testament, one angel, killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night. If you're the disciples, you're like, call them! Call them! What are you waiting for? But then, should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? See, Jesus is in control. It's like, this is what's supposed to happen. This is how it's supposed to go. It's okay. Don't be worried. We get worried about lots of things. Sometimes big things, sometimes small things. Who's really in control? We talked about it last week. Is he in control? Do you trust him or not? And the way that we make that clear in our lives is by not freaking out. Right? Not going off the deep end. Why does it seem like everything's out of control? It probably is out of control. Out of your control, out of my control, but he's in control. Jesus is just standing there. The disciples, I mean, I'm sure they're amped, right? These are just burly guys. They're just, a bunch of fishermen and, just not your high-class dudes. These are like, oh yeah, let's go. How are we going to do this, He was like, hey, just relax. It's going to be fun. There's things going on in our lives that we need to take a step back and go, he could call an angel. Or a legion. He could take care of my problem just like that. Maybe it's a difficulty. Maybe it's a temptation. And you're like, I just want him to take it away so I don't have that temptation. Right? That's what we want the troubles to go away. Just be gone. And sometimes he does that. Just boom. Your troubles are gone. Your difficulties. Those are great stories. But others, like, yeah, I've struggled for 20 years with this thing. But I have to keep choosing the way out that God has given. Oh. He says, every day I've been here teaching, you didn't go after me. Why now? Well, because Scripture has to be fulfilled. You're just part of the big plan. It's okay. Thanks for being here. Sign the guest book. And the disciples left him and fled. They're like, oh, a bunch of chickens. No, that's good. They're supposed to. Again, Scripture tells us that. What happens next? Those that, verse 57, had seized Jesus, led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, this man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you, by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." And they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" So this is the first trial, and they're all a sham. What? Well, having a trial at night was illegal, according to Jewish law. They had gathered the Sanhedrin in Caiaphas' house, and they're going to have court, and it's all against their own rules and regulations. Criminal trials must begin and end in daylight. What else? Well, you're not supposed to meet in a house, for one. You're not supposed to have a trial during Passover. And you're supposed to wait a day to give the verdict. Why? Because an acquittal could be issued on the day of the trial. So guilty verdicts had to wait one night to allow for feelings of mercy to rise. All evidence had to be guaranteed by two witnesses who were separately examined and could not have contact with each other. False witnesses were punishable by death. Nothing was done to the many false witnesses in Jesus' trial. In Jewish law, a trial always began by bringing forth evidence for the innocence of the accused before the evidence of guilt was offered. In other words, they're breaking their own rules left and right. Because they don't have in mind, let's have a nice trial and see what happens. They have an end in mind, and let's figure out how we can make it work. They broke, Warren Wiersbe said, both the letter and the spirit of the law. And here's what's amazing in all of this. It says Jesus is silent. He's got nothing to say. Why? Because it's again prophetic. Isaiah 53:7, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." And as it goes on, he's going to say a few things, but generally, he's just going to let what's going to happen, happen. And in all of that, he becomes an example to us. 1 Peter 2 says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure? This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." Throughout this trial, throughout the time before Pilate, before Herod, all these different times where he could have spoken up, he could have said, "Hey, stop it. Hey, I'm going to tell you how it is." Or let a little light shine through. He could have done all kinds of, he just let it all happen. He was innocent. Peter says that he, in all of this, is an example to us. An example isn't just, "Oh, that's nice." That means we're to follow after that example. I don't like where you're going with this. Right, because it means, oh, yeah, it means if he suffered, we're possibly going to suffer and likely will. We can't even handle not saying anything if, our brother or sister gets something that we don't, or, our neighbor or a friend, we want justice now. And the way we define that is how it benefits me versus the bigger picture once again. And, if you think for a moment, just as we pray each Wednesday for all these different nations where Christians are being persecuted, they're living out 1 Peter 2. They're suffering, and they didn't deserve it. They're enduring. And it's a gracious and good thing, Peter says, in the sight of God. And you wonder, do they wonder? When is it going to end? What's the end point of all of this? We look at it and go, oh, that's rough. But then Jesus is put under oath. He says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. This was his opportunity. This was the time Jesus could have said, you're right, I'm not. Just a guy from Nazareth. Just a hit. You're right. No. He says, yeah, you've said it. But guess what? You're going to see me at the right hand of the Father. And you're going to see me coming again. He references Psalm 110 and Daniel 7. What is he referencing? The resurrection and the second coming. And that ain't going to be good for you, Caiaphas. Why? For those that are ready, salvation and Jesus coming is an exciting event. We're looking forward to that day. But if not, not so good. This would have been the time. But Jesus didn't leave any gaps. He didn't say, I am, but, it's okay if you don't believe in me. It's okay if you figure out another way to God. It's okay if you just think of me as a good person or a good teacher. That's fine. He didn't leave those options. He either is Lord of all, or you're saying he's not. Right? There's no other options. It's the whole Lord, liar, lunatic. If he was a crazy guy, all the officials would have been like, that's just crazy Jesus. It's fine. He'll go back to Nazareth soon. We hope. He's just crazy. No one did that. Oh, he's a liar. No, this would have been the time that he'd stop lying, right? When you're going to get killed, that's when you stop lying. So we're left with, he is who he says he is. The high priest didn't look at it that way. He says he's uttered blasphemy. What's that? Declaring yourself to be God. Well, if you are God, you can declare yourself to be God. That's okay. God goes with the territory. Then Peter, verse 69. Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also are with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before him all, saying, I do not know what you mean. And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. After a little while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter was outside in the courtyard warming himself by the fire. It doesn't tell us, but we know from the Gospel of John that John was there. He's the one that got them into the courtyard. Like, how come they're not going after John? It doesn't seem fair. Right? That's what we think. It's not fair. Why are they going after Peter? What about John? Right? Well, the things that God has that are temptations for you are not for someone else. You can't look at what someone else is going through and compare. And, well, I wish I had it that easy. I wish they had what I had. They would know how tough life is then. No, you don't. You wish for what you have. You don't look at someone else positively or negatively. You just be thankful that God is dealing with you as you and not as somebody else. We don't get to compare and contrast. But they're there and they shouldn't have been there is the bottom line. Like, yeah, they were too close to the enemy. They were warming themselves up. Yeah, sort of, but the point is they didn't listen to Jesus. Like, what? Jesus told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Oh, never, Lord. Never. I'll die for you. No, you're going to deny me. You should go with that, right? If Jesus speaks to you, you should go with that. You shouldn't argue with Jesus. It's a good rule to have. Right? So when God speaks by His Word, you should go with that. Oh. See, the Word became flesh and dwelt among them, and He spoke to him, and He argued with them. Quoted earlier, Zechariah 13:7, that the sheep would be scattered. It was okay that they left. They were supposed to leave. John 18, when they were looking for Jesus, he says, I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. When they came for him, here I am. In John, they all fall over. That's kind of a fun part too. He says, I'm the guy, but let all these ones go. They were supposed to scatter. But John and Peter, well, we can't scatter. We got to see what's going to happen. They're curious cats. What's going to happen to Jesus? Maybe we get help. You didn't help so far, Peter. If you're going for the head, that wasn't great. And then even if you're going for the ear, Jesus already healed him. When we ignore or try to argue with the Lord, it usually doesn't go well for us. It didn't go well for Peter. So a little servant girl comes up. I think you're one of those. You're with Jesus, aren't you? And she presses the second time. No, you definitely are. I don't even know the man. He's intimidated. He's a big, burly fisherman. Little servant girl. You think you're one of them? No. No, really? You were with Jesus of Nazareth? No, I don't even know the guy. And then others join in. Yeah, you talk funny. You're definitely one of them. We know, because we don't speak like you. You're from up north, aren't you, pal? And he curses and swears and, vehemently, no way, I am not. And then the rooster crows. And it's like a little bell went off in his mind. And in the other gospel, it tells us he looks and he sees Jesus at that moment. And he's just crushed. Peter, not Jesus. Jesus looked at him, I bet, was just one with grace and love. He didn't sneer at him like, don't you say. Why? Because Peter would have gone, the ending would have been a little different. Right? He had such love for Peter. And he has such love for us. Imagine, because we sin, and sin ultimately is against God. Think about it. That's what he was doing. He was sinning against God. Joseph, when Potiphar's wife said, come and lie with me, he's like, yeah, no. Why? Because I can't do this wicked thing and sin against God. What if every time we sin, a little rooster crowed? Oh, right? Every time. Imagine. Why? Because you're sinning against the Lord. What if we viewed sin that way? See, this betrayal, it's sin involved here, right? It's not doing the good you know you're supposed to do. Denying what he said he would do. Oh, I will say it for sure. I'll stand with Jesus until I'm asked about it. Then no way. And if we viewed our lives that way, where the rooster would crow in our mind, what would happen? Well, I think we would be quick to repent, hopefully. And I think it might help us sin less. Why? Because we'd recognize sin ultimately is against God. And we'd recognize, I can't stand on my own. That's part of the problem. And that's what we'll see with the disciples even after the resurrection. When they just go back to doing what they've always done. Because without the power of the Spirit, you can't live the life God's called you to. So Peter denies. It says he went out and wept bitterly. And we'll get to that, what that looks like and why it was the first step in change. He should have probably not been around there, but neither should John. No one's writing about that. And John wasn't a very good influence. Right? Because he got them into the courtyard. Like, where did you go, John? So he became broken. But then he's going to be able to be used. Jesus prayed. He was strengthened. He understood the will of the Lord. Sometimes maybe we pray and we don't quite get it, but we kind of have a sense this is what God wants me to do. Go with that. You're like, yeah, but what if I don't know? That's why it's called a faith walk. Right? There's moments where you're not going to have it all laid out. You're not Jesus. You're not going to know everything in advance. You're going to have a peace that passes understanding, so walk in that. keep praying, keep in communication with the Lord, so that when temptation comes, there's a way of escape, you take that way. The problem for Peter was he wasn't prayed up. Jesus had prayed up. He was on his knees so he could stand with power and with strength in the face of tremendous opposition, in the face of pure evil. If we try to live our lives just trying to be better, just trying to be good on our own, we'll fail all the time, and we'll feel that failure. We'll feel like, wow, I'm not a very good Christian. You'll be like, no, you're not. Like, that's kind of rude. Well, because it's not about you trying harder. It's about surrendering more and letting the Spirit of God work in you and through you. And then you'll be dependent on the Lord, so you're praying regularly and constantly. Why? Because you know it's not in you to live the life God's called you to. And as you pray, you'll be understanding, I don't want my will, I want His will. Because you've seen what's happened when your will has happened. It's never good, right? It becomes a mess. And so when temptation comes your way, and it'll come, it comes to us all, you'll have the availability and the strength for the way of escape. It's there. Will you take it?